Everybody for tuning in once again to Coder Conversations. If you want to catch up on any past episodes, visit us at www.coderconvos.com. It's your host, Kevin, and I'm with Brian.
Hey, how's it going? This is Brian Russick. I am a full time musician, drum teacher in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York. And you can find me at brianrussick.com.
And for tonight's guest, we have Maria Cassano, a writer for CNN, NBC, an author, and just multi talented. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Definitely pleased to have you on. We typically like to get started by asking our guests about their background. So if you don't mind, how did you get into writing and how did you end up writing for CNN, NBC, and some of these bigger sites?
Sure. So I have always known that I wanted to be a writer. I would say I started around 10 or 11, and I was raised by a professional musician who taught me that you can make a living doing whatever you want as long as you're business minded about it. So I got an English degree, which everyone was telling me was crazy unless I wanted to be a teacher. And
Right,
then
right.
I just got very, very lucky. I applied to a lifestyle writing job at Bustle Digital Group. And they came back to me a couple weeks later and they said, the position's been filled, but do you want to be an e commerce writer? And I said, what the F is an e commerce writer? But I figured I would say yes now, learn later, which is
Yeah.
exactly what I did. Uh,
Awesome.
and then that
Awesome.
was kind of at the beginning of e-commerce where the publications were just starting to do that. So got my foot in the door really early, was able to work part-time there, get some other freelance clients. And that's how I ended up at, NBC, CNN. Um, yeah, and so I've been doing that for about 10 years now.
That's exciting.
Oh, awesome. So you said your father was a professional musician. So what made you end up going to writing versus music?
I think we were always just encouraged to be as creative as possible, but I was always an introvert and I did not have the stage presence that my father had, my mom had, my brother had. So I think I just ended up, you know, doing the more introverted way
Sure.
into creativity. I also was diagnosed with a dissociative disorder a couple years ago, and I think writing was kind of dissociative in a way in which you could just sort of like lock yourself away and create this world with just marks on a page. And
Sure.
it felt very safe to me while I was growing up. And I've since healed from that dissociative disorder, which is what my upcoming memoir is about. But I think it's just always felt like a very safe, comfortable way to be creative, that outlet.
Awesome. So yeah, you kind of spoke of dissociative disorder. I feel like, reading the symptoms, I might have like avoidant personality, kind of like if I go in a room, I like going in the back or in the corner somewhere.
Same here. Yep.
Like I don't really like drawing attention to myself. So, just being
Yeah.
able to deal with that personality disorder and still do things that are social. Have you had to really overcome a lot of those challenges as well?
Yeah. So, well, I think it's worth noting that most people have experienced a dissociative episode within their lives. It's actually a natural state that the brain reaches when it's just too overwhelming. So, most people have experienced it. A dissociative disorder happens when you're kind of in that disconnected state all the time and it kind of starts to get in the way of your life. For me, it manifested in romantic relationships. I had a really hard time connecting and being vulnerable with other people. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think avoidance is common for a lot of people, especially in, social situations, and it can help to detach, and I think for me, coming to terms with my dissociative disorder is learning that it's not all bad. It does kind of make certain situations easier. It made me a really good worker. I was able to, kind of disconnect from any bodily discomfort or emotional discomfort and work, 12, 14, 16-hour shifts. So
Wow.
it does come in handy, you know?
Wow.
Yeah, it has its ups and downs just like anything, and, like, what's really amazing to me is just how different people can be, like, extroverted people, they get energy from being around other people, whereas, like,
Right.
introverts, you feel drained constantly being around other people, you need to retreat.
And recharge the batteries, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, I'm very much so in the latter bucket. I like I said, I've been fully remote since
Yeah.
2016. I can do maybe 1 or 2 social events, a week, and then I need to recharge the rest of the time. But what's interesting since being back in my body is I think I dissociated because I was so much of an empath and a highly sensitive person, so that
Right.
when I was out in social situations, I was just picking up on people's energy and absorbing all of it from a really young age. So I think I just absorbed too much of it and then just shut off entirely
And
because I just
yeah,
kind of
and
reached.
you probably didn't know how to kind of shield yourself from other people's energy, because I'm very similar in that way. I wouldn't consider myself an empath, very sensitive. I used to have a hard time just even going to a store like Target or Walmart. I would feel all the people's energy in the store. And yeah, I think really you have to set firm boundaries. You have to know where does your energy start, where does it end, where do other people's energy begin, where does it end. I think it's really that to me was really important to find out. What is my own energy? Where is my own energy? What does that mean to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And little kids don't know how to do that. They're just in a brain state where they're just absorbing, absorbing, absorbing. And there are no boundaries. There are no, this is my energy or this is my feeling versus this is my family's feeling, or they just kind of absorb everything. So, um, yeah, I think it kind of gets placed on the individual to grow up and realize what's theirs and what's not.
Right.
So I kind of feel like I'm an introvert, definitely introvert, but I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't think I'm an empath. So I'm just curious as to like, how does that feel exactly? Like you go into a new environment and just the general tone and tenor, you start absorbing and like kind of becoming that.
Yeah, so for me, I grew up in a household with a brother who was undiagnosed bipolar, and so his feelings were so big that I think I noticed from a really young age. I watched and saw how he fed off of people's emotions and their energy. And I noticed, okay, when my mom gets anxious, he feeds off that. When my dad gets angry, he feeds off of that. But if I don't present any emotions, he can't feed off of them. And then the more I started to do that, I started to realize other people seem to like me better this way when I'm just more even toned and calm, and I'm a fixer, not, I don't add to their discomfort with my own discomfort.
Right.
And so then, as I started my healing journey, which involved a therapy modality called EMDR, I was put right back in my body for the first time in 20 years. And I felt all the emotions that I'd been blocking out over those 20 years. And um, then the empathy flooded back, and it was really overwhelming because I kind of went from 0 to 100 really quickly. And so the
Wow.
past couple years have been.
It's intense.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, I was just for 48 hours, I felt out of my mind. I felt
Yeah.
like, am I broken? Did I break myself? Did EMDR break me?" Um, because I really
Right.
just went from feeling nothing to feeling everything. And so the
Wow,
past
that's
couple
quite a
years.
shift. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's quite a
no, it
shift.
it was. And so for the past couple years, I've just been trying to figure out where that line is that you were talking about. How far do I take empathy before I'm taking on too much of somebody else's pain?
Right, like where do you start? Where do they begin? Because if you just take it on collectively, it's overwhelming. But if you can be in your own energy and saying, "This is me. I'm here. I can feel myself here." I think you're able to more set firm boundaries between your energy and other people's energy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I learned that it's not always beneficial for you or for the other person to take on their pain all the time. I was listening to
Yeah,
a podcast. I really wish I remember who it was, but it was a parenting expert. And I don't have kids. I don't want kids, but I find parenting podcasts really interesting because I think it teaches us all about our own inner child and our, our upbringing. And this particular expert said, when you absorb all of your child's discomfort, you're not doing them any favors because you're not teaching them how to sit in that discomfort or how to handle life's problems or how to relate to their own body or feel their own emotions. And I think I took that and I kind of applied it to everyone around me because for years I would absorb other people's discomfort because I didn't want to feel it myself and I wasn't capable of feeling it with myself.
right.
And now I've kind of realized when I make everyone's life easier by taking on all their problems and fixing them before they have the ability to feel discomfort, they're not learning what they're here to learn, which is how to handle life, how to sit in their emotions.
Yeah, and that's really what you're describing, the way you're describing it, that's how I grew up too. I grew up with, a bipolar mother, probably undiagnosed bipolar sister, and dealing with all those emotions. And then my dad had really bad depression. And so just dealing with all of that, taking it all on, like I felt like I had to be the fixer upper. I needed to, heal my sister and heal my mom and heal my dad and my brother when it's not possible. It's just, you can't take, I mean, you can, but you really shouldn't take on that much of other people's energy and problems and so I found it very overwhelming, and it took me a long time to learn firm boundaries. I probably was maybe 20 or 21 where I really started to be able to set those boundaries for myself.
That's young, in my opinion.
Oh, okay.
I think you
It's
learned something that some adults never learn, so that's incredible. I mean, I'm 33 now and I'm still learning to set firm boundaries, but so I think some people never figure it out.
good point. Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned that the treatment kind of brought back a lot of those suppressed emotions. Do you kind of feel like, although it was overwhelming, you rediscovered like a missing piece of yourself, like life is more richer now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the memoir, I dive into my dating history and essentially how I was incapable of having a healthy romantic relationship to save my life because if you don't have emotions, you don't have vulnerability. And um, I think keeping people at arm's length and being very avoidant, like you had mentioned, was a way of keeping myself safe. So it was extremely overwhelming when all of those emotions, cracked open and I felt all of them. It still gets overwhelming. There's still moments where I kind of wish I could just flip the switch and go back to dissociating because like I said, there are a lot of benefits, but to me there are so many more benefits to being open and raw and vulnerable. And, one of the biggest ones is that I'm capable of having really deep, meaningful conversations with people. I'm capable of having great friendships. I'm capable of having a romantic relationship that's fulfilling in a way I've never experienced before. So part of it sucks, but in my opinion, it's worth it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, it definitely seems like a lot of the introverts they have romantic issues, because you're kind of hiding yourself. You're not really connecting with others. So, like, as you've opened up more, how have things changed for you romantically?
So, I'm in a committed relationship for I think it's almost 3 years now, and for the
Oh,
first time
wow.
in my life, I am not
Awesome.
crawling out of my skin. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think any other relationship I was in,
Yeah.
no fault of the guys that I was with, but due to my own commitment issues, I think the second things got committed, I was looking for the door. I was trying to
Looking
self
for the
sabotage.
door, the exit. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I think once I realized what the root of that was, which, was fear of getting hurt. And if I left first, then no one else could hurt me.
Sure.
And really pulling at those strands through EMDR, um, I've changed a lot. But one of the things that I've really been trying to own is my own introversion, rather than seeing it as this negative. Um, I think highly sensitive people and introverted people and empathic people, it's a superpower to a certain extent. And the reason
Yeah.
why we can't be out in public for an extended period of time is just because we're picking up on so many stimuli, and we're picking up on so many emotions. So we just kind of reach our threshold faster than the average person. But the flip side of that is, highly sensitive people are very empathic. They're very detail oriented. They're very focused. They're very, they're capable of absorbing material and information. And so I think in the past, I would try to push past my introversion and dissociate and pretend like I was an extrovert and pretend like I wanted to do all these things that I didn't want to do. And now it's just something that I try to own. In my relationship, I'm in a relationship with an extrovert, and anytime he's like, "Well, I wish you could stay out a little bit later," or "I wish," I'm like, "Okay, but
Yeah.
I'm up at 6 in the morning making you coffee. I'm very detail oriented." It kind of comes with its
Yeah.
own set of benefits. So my advice to introverts would be to own it and realize that it's a superpower in its own right. And our culture tends to award extroverts more than introverts, but
Correct.
we have
Yeah.
skills that they don't have. So
There's like a flip side to it all.
yeah, absolutely. As with anything.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that there's not necessarily anything wrong with you. You're just different and you have to embrace it like you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. And if you're not ready to embrace it, then or if you feel like you'd rather change it, then there's always therapy like EMDR.
And can you explain what EMDR is?
Yeah, sure. So it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And there have been a lot of peer reviewed studies that prove that it's an extremely effective therapy modality for trauma, but also for anxiety, for sometimes bodily discomfort. It's just it's very effective in a lot of the things that they've tested it for, and it tends to be faster and more powerful than standard talk therapy. And the way that it works is you are stimulating both sides of your body, something called bilateral stimulation, through either moving your eyes back and forth or tapping on either side of your body, or sometimes it's tones in either side of the ear. You're listening to headphones, and the science behind it is that your traumatic memories are stored in your amygdala, which is the fight or flight center of the brain, and your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that deals with logic. Those two parts of your brain are in just different wavelengths. So that's why, like, when you have a trauma, your triggers, there's no reasoning with them, right? There's no convincing someone who's seen combat, like, oh no, it's just fireworks, you're going to be okay, because the fight or flight part of their brain kicks on and tells them, like, I'm in danger. So, what EMDR does through bilateral stimulation is it stimulates the fight or flight center of your brain so you can finally release and process your traumatic memories.
Oh, wow.
So, in my case, I was able to talk about the things that happened to me like I was reading a grocery store list. It didn't affect me because I was so dissociated. And then once we added EMDR to the mix, all of a sudden the emotions just like bubbled out of me. And I was finally able to process these things, 10, 20 years later.
Wow, that sounds really intense.
Yeah. I do always like to say that it's not this intense for people without a dissociative disorder. So whenever I describe it, I
Yeah,
think I kind of scare the crap out of people and they're like, I would
right.
never want to try that. But I think the reason why it was extra intense in my case is because I was going from a dissociative disorder to feeling these things. So if you are kind of processing things as you go, but you've got some trapped trauma, which is most of us, I don't think EMDR would be that much of a night and day difference.
I see.
So yeah, you mentioned that there were quite a few benefits, such as improved romantic relationships. Do you also feel like that made your writing even better since you can really express your emotions, like a whole new world opened up?
I hope so. So I've been trying since I was 18 to get a literary agent, and I have just managed to do that. And prior
Oh,
to
congrats.
Thank you, thank you. Um, prior to that, I was writing fiction. And I think fiction was another thing that was very easy to hide behind because you're just kind of making stuff up. You know, you take little aspects of yourself and people you know, but you kind of turn it into something fake. And it's much easier to put it out there in the world. Um, and so I had never tried writing memoir or nonfiction or anything about my life until this happened, you know, this healing journey through EMDR. And then I was back in my body and I was really feeling things. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had something personal to say and I felt like I wanted to put it out there. Um, and
That's
after I did
awesome.
that, things happened very quickly. So
Right.
yeah, I do think that it, you know, I think people want to read things that are human and vulnerable. And, you know, right now I'm building up my following on Medium. You know, while my book is out on submission to publishing houses, they want to see that you have a built-in readership. And as an introvert, I was never good at social media. I was never good at putting myself out there. Uh, but then I kind of noticed the more vulnerable and honest I was, the more readers I had. And, you know, I always say it feels like publishing my diary. Like it feels very vulnerable and very terrifying in some
Right.
aspects. And then when you do
Right.
it on the internet, you get trolls, you get people who don't like you, and like that's a whole other,
Yeah.
you know, physiological reaction of the fight or flight response. But yeah, it has been really rewarding in a way that I think writing fiction for me never was.
Yeah, I think there's also a very powerful element of the fact that you're expressing something that you went through. Somebody can read that and be like, "I'm going through that too. She made it, and I can make it too." So it's also more inspirational as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, you know, the more people I talk to about it, like, you know, Brian just said growing up with bipolar family members, or I think even if you don't have a dissociative disorder, um, it's very relatable because, you know, everyone has felt like they needed to carry weight for other people, or everyone has felt like, you know, maybe they weren't good enough, or, you know, and one thing I found that has been really interesting through this writing journey and posting articles and essays online is that I'm realizing a lot of women, even if they don't have dissociative disorders, have felt like they needed to self-abandon in order to make themselves more palatable. And I think that's something that our culture asks of everybody, but especially women. You know, you be
Right.
quiet and don't be so hysterical and calm down. And
Calm
um,
down. Right.
yeah, so I think even if you don't have a dissociative disorder, you can relate to this feeling of you being too much and having to hide parts of yourself away to make yourself more palatable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because oftentimes in society we're expected to be one way, like a man, be quiet, be stoic, be hard, be tough, never cry. And from a man's point of view, a lot of men they end up blowing up, because they've had to repress themselves so long. And I'm sure it's the same exact same way for women. Like, hey, don't lean into your nature, be this preconceived way of being. But like you mentioned, I'm sure
Right.
it's really freeing to be able to embrace yourself and lean into that a little more versus just acting like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our culture tells both men and women to be less of who they are in different ways. You know, I think, like you said, the only emotion that's quote unquote socially acceptable for men is anger, and for women
Right.
it's just kind of like, you know, put all of your own needs aside and serve the people around you.
Sure.
But I don't think it's beneficial for anybody. You know, I think
No.
I write a lot of dating content on Medium, you know, from the lens of what I went through. And then, you know, I was single for 3 years. I probably went on hundreds of dates looking for somebody and really
Oh,
leaning
wow.
into it with this new vulnerability. And so much of what I saw is just this miscommunication between what men think women want and what women are actually looking for. And so much of it boils down to emotion, you know?
That's
I think
interesting.
we all want to be vulnerable with each other, but there's just this miscommunication that neither of us should be vulnerable with each other, you know?
Yeah, I think like for me growing up, as we're talking about, bipolar family members, you just start to learn that, okay, for me to be safe, for me to have my safe space or safe place, I need to introvert. I need to go inside myself. I need
Yeah.
to shut all the doors, shut the windows, keep people out. Because when I'm very open with people, I end up taking on all of their energy, all of their feelings. And then all of a sudden, I'm right there with that person. I'm now feeling, what my sister is feeling or what my mom is feeling. And it's quite overwhelming, especially when you're at that young age that you don't know that's what's happening. You just think, oh, I'm just walking into this room and having a conversation with my family member. But what's really happening is, you're walking in that room and all of your energy now is leaving you and the other person's energy is coming into you. And it's just very, very overwhelming. So I had a pretty tough time, with figuring that out as I grew up. But like I said, by the time I was maybe 20, 21, I realized, to set firm boundaries and to be in my own, be comfortable in my own energy. And that's been really crucial. It's been, a vital and just important part of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even to learn to make space for your own emotions, because I think um, when you're so used to taking on everybody else's, you forget that you have your own. And for me, that was a big
That's huge.
factor. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's huge.
Yeah, and I think I kinda needed to move, I think there was a larger reason why I waited so long to tackle this through EMDR. I had bought a house in the middle of nowhere. I moved an hour away from everybody I knew. I was living entirely alone. I had just broken up with my boyfriend of 3 years. Like, I was alone. It was the middle of the pandemic. Um, and I think I waited until I was in this vacuum to start this healing process, because I think I intuitively knew I need to be entirely alone before I can look at my own emotions, because I really don't know what my own feelings are, um, unless they're reflected against somebody else's, and it kind of felt like the safety thing. So, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that, you waited until you were out of that environment to learn to draw boundaries and to look at your own emotions.
Right.
So yeah, you mentioned like dating. You went on a ton of different dates, but simultaneously you were becoming more vulnerable and healing. So how did you kind of balance, you know, being more vulnerable versus the toxic environment that can be modern dating?
So I led with all my baggage, which I would recommend. I would walk into those dates and like hold out my hand and be like, "Hi, I'm Maria. I am getting my tubes tied and I am in trauma therapy for severe commitment issues." And
Yeah.
I think it was so important that I led with that, because I
Yeah.
had hidden so much of myself for so long. I kind of felt like a newborn. I was learning what I liked. I was learning what my boundaries were. I was learning what my feelings were. And so, and I was also approaching 30. So I think I kind of had this mentality of like no time to waste, but also nothing to lose. And if you can't handle where I'm at right now, I'd rather know from date one.
Immediately, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just get that out in the open, right?
Yes. Yeah. But modern dating is a mess. It really,
Nightmare.
it really
Yeah,
is.
swiping, all these apps. It's,
Yeah,
the
it
thing
is.
is, everyone thinks, "Oh, I deserve the top 1%." And so you have everyone thinking, "Oh, well, I deserve the top 1%." So you're swiping, okay, no, no, I don't want to date that person. I don't want to date that, But like back in the day, you would have just met someone in school and you would have dated, or you would have been hanging out at the mall and you went up to a girl and started talking to her. It's not this whole, oh, I need that upper echelon. I need that, top 1%. And I think that's what's really messing with our culture and dating. And I think it's a huge mess.
Yeah, but I also think it's kind of a double-edged sword, where you know, we do have way more of a selection than ever before. And I encourage people to be picky, and have, very high standards, especially women, because, women didn't have their own bank accounts until the 1970s. And now that we do have our own bank accounts and, we can work and we're financially stable, I think there was this pressure to move in and marry the first person you met, 18 years old.
Yeah.
And, we saw how that turned out culturally. The divorce rates are really high. So I think people should take their time finding their person. But I also think that people need to be putting in the same amount of work that they expect from their partner. If you want someone who is communicative and emotionally stable, and, you need to be going to therapy as well. You need to be working on those things. You got to be reading, self-help books or however you can become a better person. Um, and I think I found myself in a really good relationship once I started putting in that work and working on myself as hard as I could to become the best person that I could be. Because I really, while I was dissociated, I knew right from wrong. But because of the lack of empathy that I felt, I was not the best person that I could have been. So I think people also need to take responsibility for their end of it. And I think once people start doing that, hopefully the dating landscape will become a lot more manageable.
So you mentioned you write a lot about modern dating.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example?
Um, so I found myself really interested in gender dynamics, obviously. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just write a lot about what it was like to re-enter the dating game as an almost 30-year-old, learning all these things about myself. And, I write about what it was like to find my current partner, and um, how we built this relationship through vulnerability and communication. And, um, I think it resonates with a lot of people. Like I said, I do get a lot of trolls, people saying, they
Yeah.
think it's the exact opposite. But I write a lot about how I think, therapy and vulnerability is very beneficial for men, especially because, all the reasons that you were talking about, Kevin, where, you're encouraged to suppress everything and to just be tough and not cry. And
Oh,
that
yeah.
is not healthy, nor is it sustainable. I think our culture really pushes on men this idea that they need to be these strong, stoic providers. But women are largely providing for themselves now. And I think men reach the end of their careers and they retire and they realize, what was that all for? I sold my soul to a corporation who, threw me
Yeah.
out as soon as I was too old. And they're realizing that all the things that, in my opinion, really matter on this earth, which is connection and love and following your passions, they didn't get enough of that.
Yeah, there's a huge divergence between, what really makes us happy and what society kind of programs us to believe, because, a lot of times we think it's all about competition, it's all about making money, it's all about accumulating material things, but you look at the people that already have those things, and a lot of them, they're not really that happy.
Yeah, the best study we have, a longitudinal study that studied men for decades, showed that the number one indicator of happiness was human connection.
Oh, wow.
And I know that can be really tough for introverts because naturally we like to isolate ourselves, but there eventually comes a point to where you start feeling so lonely that you're like, hey, I need to get out.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a middle ground.
for
And for
sure.
me, I think the key to that, I think because I was an empath and a highly sensitive person, and even while I was dissociated, I was really good at picking up on other people's cues and fixing their problems for them. So I think, like, I had wondered a couple times during my dissociation, like, am I a sociopath? But I think,
Yeah.
the extent to which I was so hyper vigilant to other people's reactions and feelings, and the extent that I would, feel like, okay, I need to fix this for them. I knew I wasn't. Um,
So people pleasing.
yes, exactly, which, I
Yeah.
think is very common for a lot of people, but especially women. And I think, when I came back into my body and got that awareness of that, the types of friends that I chose was really important. And now I tend to surround myself with people who reciprocate rather than take advantage. And I think that has made all the difference. Now I have like a very close knit group of girlfriends, which I've never had before. I was always, I think, because I was dissociated, I was drawn more to guys who tend to be a little bit more stoic, and so they didn't make me feel the emotions I didn't want to feel.
Yeah,
Um,
right, 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 right.
and now I have this very close knit group of girlfriends that, you know, give as much as they take. And when I hang out with them, even though I'm an introvert, it kind of feels like my cup is full rather than empty. So, I
So
would
it's like a
encourage.
two-way street. It's 50-50.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like they're also very, you know, highly sensitive and very empathic and very self-aware, and they're all working on themselves. And so when we get together, it just feels very rejuvenating rather than draining. So I would encourage empaths to seek out relationships like that rather than people who are just kind of gonna take advantage of everything you have to give.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point about having the correct group of friends around you because if you're around a toxic group of friends, then you're gonna constantly feel drained. A lot of times they might be the source of like these neurological disorders because maybe they're always making you the butt of the jokes or they're telling you, oh no, you can't do that. So I think we also have to be courageous enough to be able to disassociate ourselves with a group of friends that are toxic.
Yeah, yeah, and from a psychological perspective, I think we tend to repeat the same relationships that we had as children. So for me, growing up, in a household with a bipolar brother, it kind of felt like he was always taking, 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 taking. So when I was choosing friends or romantic relationships, I would choose people who needed me more than I needed them and, would take,
Yeah,
take, take because that's how I felt comfortable. The way the brain is laid out is it's all these synapses, and the neurons that you use the most are the most worn roads in your brain. So choosing someone who might be healthier for you feels like going from a highway to a little dirt road, and it feels really uncomfortable the first several times you do it until you get used to it. So a lot of people, hop off on that dirt road and meet someone who might be healthier than the relationships that they had as a kid, and they think this is uncomfortable. And
right.
they confuse, that unfamiliarity for this isn't what I want, or I'm not attracted to this, or and they get back on that highway and go for those toxic relationships all over again. And it could be in romantic relationships, it could be in friendships. So, for me, I think analyzing the types of relationships that I was attracting into my life was really paramount.
That's awesome. So what made you want to be a writer, when you were a little girl?
So I think I was a big reader. My dad would always read to me, and then I kind of just like lost myself in books a lot, and I just liked the idea of being able to create whatever I wanted, just me and a computer. It just felt very safe and creative, and I actually got started. This is the most embarrassing thing I will ever admit. I wrote fan fiction as a middle schooler. Um, and then, when I got my stuff out there and people started responding, I was like, okay, this is a good way to connect with people and communicate. And now, now that I'm on Medium and writing about much more serious things, thank God, um, I've made a lot of really good connections there too. Like I said, I think when you're just vulnerable and you put yourself out there, you are surprised by how receptive people can be.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that you are being vulnerable through your writing because, society a lot of times, everybody's a guru. Everybody that's popular has the answers for you, and that's how they make money. So we get this false impression that everybody's doing good, everybody's perfect, and you start to feel isolated. You're like, is something wrong with me? But the reality is, we all have issues going on. So you being vulnerable, it allows people to get a more realistic and relatable picture of life.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think so many people want to be, putting out master classes and, this is how I conquered the world in 5 minutes and made my $1 billion. But none
Yeah,
of that is realistic, and
it's
none of that
not.
is going to make people happy. So
It's not. Yeah, no, it really isn't.
And I think, society kind of has that carrot dangling in front of us that, hey, once you get this money and fame and title, then you've made it. But once you have it, a lot of people are like, what's next? And, they're still searching.
yeah, no, I recently wrote an article about how, like I said, I've been trying to get a literary agent since I was 18. And I was just like, go, 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 3 manuscripts, just nonstop querying. And then the day after I signed with my literary agent, I woke up and I fell into a depression for a couple weeks, which was so confusing to me because, first of all, I'm not a depressed person. And second of all, I'm like, this is all I've ever wanted. And the
Right.
more I looked into it, the more I, saw the research behind it, dopamine is responsible for motivation, not reward. So people tend to think once I get this thing that I've been working towards, I'm going to be so happy, I'm going to be over the moon. But in actuality, dopamine is the hormone that's firing the entire time you're working towards something. And then once you finally get it, the dopamine drops off. So it's this thing called the arrival fallacy where people think, once I get that house, once I get that $1 million, once I do this thing, I'll finally be happy.
Yeah.
But oftentimes
Yeah.
it's the exact opposite. You kind of wake up with that thing and you wonder, like, what now? And then you realize that life is just this long stretch of just mountain after mountain after mountain. And that's where the beauty is. So, thank God I found that research because I was like, what's wrong with me? Like you said.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's a good point that you brought up though about, people getting money or fame and then thinking like, "Oh, this is going to make me happy. Now I'm going to be happy. I have $1 million." But, I spent a better part of 10 years out in LA, and I met some really wealthy people out there, and what I noticed was the wealthier the person, usually the more disappointing they felt, or just unhappy, miserable,
Yeah.
unhappy, but they have millions of dollars. It doesn't make any sense. They have
Yeah.
millions of dollars, but they're really unhappy. And I've heard, people talk about billionaires and they're like, well, billionaires are not even happy.
Yeah, and fame especially. I think once people assume that fame is going to be a fix all, but all you're doing is taking all of your problems you've ever accumulated throughout your entire life and putting them under a microscope for the
Right.
entire world to see. I was watching these videos of Chapel Rowan. Have you heard of her? She's a pop star, Gen Z pop star. So she's good. She puts out good music, but I'm more interested in these videos that she makes telling people, I don't care if you think it's rude. Uh, don't approach me in public. It's not okay to grab me. It's not okay to. And she's really the first, female especially, but celebrity that we've seen kind of put their foot down because in the past, every time a celebrity has done that, we've all ripped them apart. Like, oh, you don't appreciate what you have. You don't. But now these
Right.
psychologists are coming out and saying that fame is deeply traumatic because everyone knows who you are, but you don't know who these people are. They're stalking you, they're leaving messages in your machine, they're grabbing at you in public, and you're constantly in a state of fight or flight when in actuality all these people want is to be recognized for their craft, and I think one of the reasons why I really like the idea of writing is because, I mean, if you think of your favorite author, do you know what they look like? Probably not. Would you know who they were if you saw them in public? So, like, I kinda like
Yeah.
the anonymous factor of, like, yeah, you could be a great writer, you could put out books, but, like, you can still leave your house in comfort. Because I think, especially as an introvert, fame would destroy me. Even when I get, like, mean comments on my articles, my whole body freezes up, and I have to stop and be like, "Okay, the reason this is happening is because, psychologically, we're programmed to care about other people's approval because we are tribal creatures, and in the past, while we were caveman, if you got tossed out of the tribe, you were as good as dead. So, we're hardwired to care about other people's approval. So then all of a sudden, when millions of people know who you are, and then thousands of people are disapproving of you, it's it's traumatic.
It's funny you say that because it makes me think when I was younger, I started playing drums at 14, but I didn't actually put any of my videos on YouTube until maybe 25, 26. And it largely just had to do with, I didn't want to get trolled. I didn't want people leaving me negative comments, making fun of me or whatever. But the funny thing is, finally, when I did it, finally, I started putting up videos. I got just this, huge amount of encouragement from people, and, lightness and brightness, and just a lot of positivity. And it made me realize, oh, okay, people aren't all that bad. And, yeah, there's trolls, but, there's not that many of them. And, that you can really express yourself and put yourself out there, and people will connect with it and they'll appreciate it. And I've been releasing content pretty steadily ever since then.
Yeah, and I think that's what people have to focus on. The negativity bias is really hard to overcome, and that, we might get 100 positive comments, and that one negative comment, we cannot stop thinking about it. But I think there's always going to be haters, you know.
Now,
You
why
could
do you think that is? That as humans, we just kind of like narrow in and just focus on that negative comment, that negativity. How come we can't just be happy with all the positivity around us?
I think it all just has to do with survival. When we were hunter gatherers and we were cavemen, and this is when our brains developed, we had to be hyper attuned to the negativity around us because it could mean the difference between life or death. So now that we're in a modern society and we don't have to worry about, tigers, our brain focuses on like that comment that our boss made that was kind of rude. So our brains, I don't think, have caught up to the moderately safe environment that we live in. So instead, it focuses on the negative stuff.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So yeah, being vulnerable. I think like that kind of ties in with fame because, like you said, it puts a magnifying glass on everything you do. But a lot of times, we as the normal people, we don't think that celebrities have feelings. Like we will say incredibly nasty things, and we'll write it off like, oh, they have money, but they might be reading your comment, and it really affects them.
Yeah. Or, it's just so socially ingrained. I grew up when tabloids were big, and I remember people ripping Jessica Simpson to shreds because she gained 20 pounds, or, when Britney Spears, who had a mental illness, wasn't doing well. Like, it was just constant barrage of these celebrities, and people, it was just socially acceptable to rip them to shreds. Um, and I think that's, in some ways, our culture has gotten better about it. But in other ways, I think the internet has kind of introduced this whole other layer where everyone's a keyboard warrior and everyone wants to tell you their opinions. And statistically speaking, if someone disagrees with something or is very opposed to something, they're much more likely to leave a comment. So from the other end of things, you might have 100 people who scroll past your video or your article or whatever you're putting out there and think, that was cool, but they don't interact with it. It's the person who's like, I don't like you and I want to tell you, that feels the need to comment on it. Um,
Right. It's like, or like Yelp makes me think of
Yes,
Yelp.
exactly, yeah, exactly. The world is just
Yeah.
one big Yelp.
One big Yelp. Exactly.
Yeah, I kind of feel like fame can put a lot of people in that disassociative state of mind because, oh, these people are going to tear me up, so I'm only going to give them very curated versions of me.
Yeah, honestly, fame sounds miserable, and people, it's a little bit controversial when I say that, but it fame would be my worst nightmare, to be completely honest. I don't know. I think the older I get, the more I really appreciate my routine and my privacy, and I know that sounds contradictory because I'm talking about putting all my stories out there and being vulnerable, but at the end of the day I get to shut my laptop and focus on myself, and I don't have to worry about leaving my house. Or but yeah, I think it's really messed up the way that our culture treats celebrities as if they're not people.
Yeah, and they can't even, like, for instance, just go walk around in the mall or just go to a restaurant they want to sit down because you're gonna have all these swarms of people coming after them, and it's like a prison. There's just like you might gain access to some things, but you lose just the everyday ability to just be out and about, and that's a huge loss of freedom, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it must feel like you're, chained into your house, and then I think people assume, oh, the money is a good trade-off, but scientifically speaking, that doesn't really make people much happier either. After you can fulfill your basic needs, hunger, roof over your head, or you don't have to worry about bills, it really does not increase our happiness levels that much. So
Yeah, it makes me think like so in the Bible it says learn to be content. So there's that key word learn, meaning it's a choice. Like we often envy what somebody else has and think that if we get that, we're gonna be happy. But once we get it, it's like, oh, it's not what I thought it was. Like we have so much now. Our lifestyle is better than most kings throughout history, and yet a lot of us are still looking for that next thing that is magically going to give us happiness, and that's not it. It's something internal.
yeah, yeah, I'm not I don't consider myself Christian anymore, but I was raised Catholic, and one of the quotes that always sat with me was blessed are the poor. And, I think I always struggled with that idea because I'm like, well, the more money you have, the more you can help people and, contribute to a good life for other people. And I think the realization that I came to within my own spirituality is not that money is inherently bad. Money is like, Wi-Fi. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. It's just, it's a neutral thing. But I think the reason why the Bible says blessed are the poor is because when you're backed into a corner and you feel like you have nothing, sometimes all you feel like you can do is surrender to God or your spirituality or the greater unknown or whatever. And some of the most powerful moments of my own life have been when I felt like I was backed into a corner and I had nothing and I just needed to give up my power to something greater than myself. And I think one of the reasons why I think it was Jim Carrey that said, "I would wish that everybody could experience you know, um, fame and richness because they would realize that it's not the answer." And I think people
Yeah, I love
avoid.
that. I love that quote.
Yeah, it's so good because like I think the more money we earn and the more recognition we get, the more we realize, okay, this is not the answer. And I think one of the reasons why sometimes rich people or famous people are so unhappy is because they keep chasing, 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 chasing without realizing maybe I should try something else.
And
And
also, I think, when you have millions of dollars, multiple millions of dollars, you can buy anything, you can get anything. But then you come to that realization that, oh, that doesn't actually make me happy. The fact that I could buy a jet or a football team or whatever the case, because you can't buy people. You can't buy a happy, loving relationship. You have to cultivate that. So it's this whole other thing.
yeah, and then you even need to worry about the people that are in my life. Are they here for the right reasons? One of the things I talk about often within my writing is I was much heavier as a kid. I was about 80 pounds overweight, and from the point I was in middle school onward. And so I think I worked very hard on my personality and like learning to connect to other people, especially post association. And I think, people who are privileged in any way through money, through, fame, through, you know, pretty privileged, through anything, always need to look around and wonder, like, why are the people in my life here? And I think that was another huge aspect of me leading with, "Hi, I'm Maria and I'm in therapy for commitment issues." I wanted to make sure that people were there for the right reasons, and those right reasons being
Right.
vulnerability and wanting to connect.
Right.
Absolutely. We're getting at the top of the hour, so before we close, did you want to tell the audience where they can find you at, and did you want to tell them where they can find your book at, or when is that being published?
So it's currently out on submission to publishing houses. I do not have a book deal yet, but I do have a literary agent and we're working on it. And the more email signups I get, the more likely that I will be able to achieve a book deal. So you can find me at mariacassano.com. And then if you're interested in the book or anything involving, my medium or those personal vulnerability articles, it's mariacassano.com /num.
Awesome. And did you want to leave our audience with any closing thoughts before we get out of here?
I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh yeah, it was an amazing conversation. We really explored pretty deeply into life's mysteries, I would say.
Agreed.
And what about you, Brian? Did you have any closing question?
I guess I would say I always like to ask this to our guests, if you were to go back in time and give yourself, a tip or some kind of feedback about, oh, watch out for this in the future, what would you tell your younger self to watch out for?
I don't know if this is a cop out, but I don't think I'd change anything. I think things happen in divine timing exactly as they're supposed to, and I think if I gave my younger self any tip-offs, I wouldn't have learned the lessons that I needed to learn.
Right.
Yeah, amazing. But yeah, thank you for coming on the show. And we'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. We'll